At 4:51 in the morning on Saturday, July 25th, 2026, a magnitude 5.9 earthquake tore through the middle of New Zealand's North Island, waking people from Auckland all the way down to the top of the South Island, and triggering more than 23,000 individual felt reports in a matter of hours. But before I go any further, I need to correct something in that premise, because the actual fault responsible for this earthquake isn't one of New Zealand's famous, well-mapped danger zones at all. It's something considerably stranger, a rupture on a fault that, as of right now, doesn't even have a name, sitting in one of the quietest, least studied corners of the country's entire tectonic system. This is what actually happened near the town of Taumarunui this week, why scientists are still working out exactly which fault broke, and where New Zealand's genuinely most dangerous fault zones actually sit, because this wasn't one of them. If you want accurate, sourced reporting on real seismic events instead of exaggeration, subscribe now, because this story is still developing. It helps to put a single earthquake like this one in the context of just how seismically active New Zealand actually is as a country overall. Sitting directly on the boundary between the Pacific and Australian tectonic plates, New Zealand experiences an average of roughly 355 earthquakes in the magnitude 4 to 5 range every single year, along with close to 30 earthquakes annually in the magnitude 5 to 6 range that Saturday's Taumarunui quake falls squarely within. Earthquakes of magnitude 6 to 7 average out to roughly once every 7 months nationally, while anything in the magnitude 7 to 8 range remains considerably rarer, averaging out to roughly once every 4 years across the entire country. Viewed against that broader statistical backdrop, a magnitude 5. The M5.9 earthquake isn't actually an especially rare event for New Zealand as a whole, even though it was a genuinely rare occurrence for this specific quiet corner of the North Island. What made Saturday's quake stand out wasn't its raw magnitude compared to the national average, but rather its unusual combination of shallow depth and location directly beneath a populated area that, historically, hasn't produced earthquakes anywhere near this size. Let's start with the confirmed facts, because GeoNet, New Zealand's official geological hazard monitoring agency, has been fairly detailed in its response to this specific event. The earthquake struck at 4:51 a.m. local time, with its epicenter located roughly 5 kilometers south of the town of Taumarunui, in the King Country region of the central North Island, at a shallow depth of just 9 kilometers. GeoNet's own measurement placed the magnitude at 5.9, while the U.S. Geological Survey calculated a slightly different figure of 5.7, a discrepancy that reflects the two agencies using different calculation methods rather than any actual disagreement or revision of the event itself. GeoNet's shaking model assigned the earthquake a maximum intensity of 6.5 on the modified Mercalli intensity scale, a level at which furniture moves, objects fall from shelves, and buildings can sustain slight non-structural damage, consistent with the severe shaking GeoNet recorded close to the epicenter. The practical impact on the ground was real, but fortunately fell well short of catastrophic. Slips came down on already rain-soaked hillsides throughout the district, with State Highway 43 closing between Whangamomona and Taumarunui, and a separate slip shutting State Highway 3 through the Owakino Gorge. Though GeoNet has been clear that heavy overnight rain shares responsibility for those slips alongside the shaking itself. In the 6 hours immediately following the main shock, GeoNet located 78 separate aftershocks, the largest reaching magnitude 3.7, a pattern entirely consistent with how earthquakes of this size typically behave in the days following a significant rupture. If a story built on real, verified data straight from GeoNet and the USGS is the kind of thing you want more of, drop a like on this video right now. It genuinely helps this content reach more people who'd get value out of it. Given that Taumarunui sits within reasonable distance of some genuinely active volcanoes, Mount Ruapehu included, roughly 55 kilometers to the southeast, it's a fair question to ask whether this earthquake had anything to do with volcanic activity. According to GeoNet, the answer is no. This was a tectonic earthquake, rock breaking along a fault due to mechanical stress, not magma actively moving beneath the surface. Every volcanic alert level in the region remained completely unchanged following the quake, with Ruapehu sitting at level 1, indicating only minor unrest, exactly where it had already been sitting well before Saturday's earthquake occurred, and Tongariro, Ngauruhoe, and Taupo all remaining at the lowest possible level 0. It's worth understanding a bit more about exactly what sits inside that Taupo volcanic zone, because the name undersells just how significant the geology in this specific part of New Zealand actually is. The zone is home to the Taupo volcano itself, a supervolcano responsible for one of the largest eruptions on Earth within the last several thousand years, an event powerful enough to have visibly affected atmospheric conditions recorded in historical accounts from ancient Rome and China at the time it occurred. Today, Lake Taupo sits inside the massive caldera left behind by that eruption, and the broader volcanic zone surrounding it remains one of the most geologically active regions found anywhere on the planet. home to geothermal fields, frequent smaller eruptions at nearby volcanoes, and the kind of actively stretching crust responsible for producing exactly the type of shallow, tension-driven earthquake that struck near Taumarunui this weekend. None of that means Saturday's earthquake carries any connection to a future eruption at Taupo itself. GeoNet was explicit that every volcanic alert level in the region remained completely unchanged, but it does help explain why this particular stretch of the North Island produces such a distinctive combination of both earthquakes and volcanic activity within relatively close proximity to each other. That said, the connection between this earthquake and the region's volcanic geology isn't nothing, it's just indirect. Taumarunui sits right at the western edge of the Taupo volcanic zone, a belt of stretched, thinned crust running from Ruapehu in the south up toward White Island in the north, an area shaped by the same regional processes that allow magma to reach the surface within the zone's interior. That same underlying stretching also tends to fracture the crust, specifically along the zone's margins, exactly where Saturday's earthquake occurred. Interestingly, the volcanic zone's unusual geology also shaped how the earthquake's energy traveled outward. GeoNet noted that seismic waves actually dissipated more quickly as they crossed the volcanic zone itself, because the unusually hot, fractured crust beneath the volcanic plateau tends to absorb earthquake energy, meaning the shaking from this quake actually traveled considerably further to the north and south than it did to the east. Sparing New Zealand's east coast, the rude early morning wake-up call felt much more strongly elsewhere. If you found these details as interesting as I did while researching this, drop a comment and let me know. It genuinely helps me figure out what to cover next. Now here's where the story gets genuinely unusual, and it's the specific detail that makes the video's original framing worth correcting directly. According to GeoNet's official scientific response, this earthquake was caused by normal faulting, essentially the kind of earthquake that happens where the crust is actively being pulled apart under tension, eventually breaking along a sloping fracture as one block of rock drops relative to the other. GeoNet specifically described the mechanism as extension in the upper crust of the Australian plate, occurring at the edge of the Taupo volcanic zone, where the crust is stretching thinner due to the ongoing subduction of the Pacific plate beneath it. The shallow depth is what made this particular earthquake so unusual for the district in the first place. Most large earthquakes beneath the central King Country actually happen far deeper, inside the slab of Pacific plate sinking beneath the North Island. A magnitude 6. 2 earthquake back in October of 2018, striking beneath roughly the same part of the King Country, only about 20 kilometers from Saturday's epicenter, actually ruptured at a depth of 207 kilometers, deep enough that its energy spread out over an enormous area and arrived at the surface considerably softened. A rupture at only 9 kilometers deep, by contrast, delivers its energy almost directly upward into the towns sitting above it, which is exactly why this specific earthquake felt so severe and why residents have continued feeling so many of the following aftershocks so distinctly. Here's the detail that genuinely surprised even the geologists studying this event. As of GeoNet's official response, no named fault has been identified as the source of this earthquake, and it may never receive one. The New Zealand Active Faults database shows no previously mapped active fault trace anywhere near the epicenter. The King Country, it turns out, is a comparatively quiet corner of the country's overall tectonic picture, with its faults sparsely mapped compared to the much more heavily studied plate boundary zones on either side of it. The nearest well-documented structure, a north-to-south running normal fault system called the Raurimu Fault, sits roughly 30 kilometers away, forming the western wall of a separate down-dropped block of crust known as the Ruapehu Graben, but it doesn't appear to be directly connected to Saturday's rupture. Detailed analysis of the earthquake's radiation pattern, gathered through the USGS's moment tensor solution, confirms the crust failed in extension, pulling apart roughly north to south with a real sideways component of slip as well, but the data alone can't yet determine which of 2 possible fault orientations, one running east to west, the other running northeast to southwest, actually broke. Precisely locating the depths of the ongoing aftershock sequence over the coming weeks may eventually help settle that specific question. It's worth noting that an earthquake striking a completely unmapped fault isn't actually all that unusual in New Zealand's history. The Greendale Fault, responsible for the devastating magnitude 7. Warren-Darfield earthquake back in 2010 was entirely unknown to scientists until it tore directly across the Canterbury Plains that year. A significant portion of the strain building up across New Zealand's crust is quietly carried on faults buried under sediment, or moving too slowly to leave any obvious surface trace, meaning the country's true earthquake risk in any given location doesn't always align neatly with which faults happen to already be mapped and named. To understand just how rare an earthquake of this specific size actually is for the immediate Taumarunui area, it helps to look at the historical record. Searching GeoNet's earthquake catalog specifically for shallow quakes within roughly 35 kilometers of the town, going all the way back to 1900, shows that Saturday's earthquake is the strongest shallow earthquake ever recorded in the immediate Taumarunui area within the modern instrumental record, surpassing smaller shallow events recorded in 1957, 1995, 1997, and as recently as 2020. While the historical catalog naturally thins out the further back you search, an event of this specific size would almost certainly have been recorded at any point going back to at least the 1940s, making this a genuinely rare occurrence for this particular town. To understand just how seriously New Zealand's actual major fault systems get treated by comparison, it's worth looking at what happened during the country's last truly major earthquake. In November of 2016, a magnitude 7. 8 earthquakes struck near Kaikoura on the South Island, in a region closely tied to the broader Alpine Fault system, in an event so complex that it ended up rupturing at least 21 separate individual fault segments in sequence within a single event, something seismologists had rarely documented happening at that scale anywhere in the world before. That earthquake triggered massive landslides that cut off the town of Kaikoura by road entirely, lifted sections of the coastline by several meters, and generated a localized tsunami, ultimately claiming 2 lives and causing billions of dollars in damage. Comparing that event directly to Saturday's Taumarunui earthquake helps illustrate the genuine difference in scale and consequence between an earthquake striking New Zealand's well-documented, actively monitored major fault systems versus one striking a quiet, unmapped structure at the edge of a volcanic zone, even when the magnitude of the more recent, smaller event still felt severe to the people experiencing it directly. Now, here's the part of this story worth addressing directly, because it connects to what the original premise behind this video actually got wrong. New Zealand's genuinely most dangerous, most closely monitored fault zones aren't the quiet, unmapped structures beneath the King Country at all. They're 2 entirely different, far more extensively studied systems. The Alpine Fault runs the length of the South Island, forming the boundary between the Pacific and Australian tectonic plates. And it's widely regarded by seismologists as one of the most hazardous fault lines on Earth specifically, because of how overdue it currently is for a major rupture, with paleoseismic research indicating it has produced a major earthquake, roughly every 300 years on average. And it's been over 200 years since its last confirmed major rupture. The Hikurangi subduction zone, running along much of the North Island's east coast, represents an entirely separate and equally serious hazard, a massive fault system, where the Pacific Plate is being forced directly beneath the Australian plate, capable of producing an enormous megathrust earthquake alongside a potentially devastating tsunami, similar in basic mechanism to the fault responsible for Japan's catastrophic 2011 Tohoku earthquake. Saturday's Taumarunui earthquake had nothing to do with either of those 2 systems. It struck an entirely separate, previously unmapped structure at the edge of the Taupo volcanic zone, a genuinely interesting and rare event in its own right, but not an event that occurred anywhere near the specific fault zones that keep New Zealand's seismic hazard planners up at night. GeoNet has also been direct about one other important point worth clarifying, because New Zealand experienced a separate, unrelated, significant earthquake just over a week earlier. A magnitude 5. Nairata earthquake, according to the USGS, struck roughly 42 kilometers northwest of Te Anau in the South Island on July the 16th, an event GeoNet has confirmed has no connection whatsoever to Saturday's Taumarunui earthquake, since the 2 events occurred along entirely different plate boundary processes, separated by roughly 1,000 kilometers of distance. 2 strong earthquakes striking New Zealand within the span of 10 days is simple coincidence rather than any kind of broader emerging pattern, though both events serve as a useful reminder that earthquakes in this particular country can genuinely occur almost anywhere, mapped fault or not. Looking ahead, GeoNet expects continued aftershocks in the Taumarunui area, likely felt more widely than usual precisely because of how shallow the original rupture was, with the overall frequency of aftershocks expected to gradually decrease over the coming days. Officials have included the standard caveat that always accompanies events like this, that there remains some possibility of an additional earthquake of similar size or larger occurring in the same area. The more immediate practical hazard right now actually involves the ground itself rather than further seismic activity directly. Hillsides throughout the district were already saturated from recent heavy rainfall before the earthquake struck, and strong shaking tends to further weaken already unstable slopes, meaning GeoNet has specifically warned that additional landslides may continue occurring around the epicenter in the coming days, independent of whether any further significant aftershocks actually happen. It's worth closing on a practical note, because New Zealand's relationship with earthquakes has shaped a genuinely distinctive culture of preparedness that extends well beyond any single event like this one. The simple, widely taught response of drop, cover, and hold, dropping to the ground, taking cover under sturdy furniture and holding on until the shaking stops remains the standard, officially recommended action for anyone caught in a strong earthquake or aftershock anywhere in the country. A piece of guidance repeated so consistently through school drills and public safety campaigns that it's become close to reflexive for much of the population. GeoNet's own public messaging following Saturday's earthquake included that same guidance directly, a reminder that while this specific event struck an obscure, unnamed fault rather than one of the country's headline hazard zones, the practical response to living somewhere this seismically active stays exactly the same regardless of which specific fault happens to be responsible on any given morning. So what does all of this actually add up to? A genuinely rare magnitude 5. 9 earthquakes struck an obscure, previously unmapped fault at the western edge of New Zealand's Taupo volcanic zone in the early morning hours of July the 25th, 2026, the strongest shallow earthquake ever recorded in the immediate Taumarunui area, triggering widespread felt reports across much of the North Island and parts of the South Island, alongside road-closing landslides, but fortunately no serious structural damage or casualties. It had nothing to do with volcanic activity in the region, despite sitting close to Ruapehu, and nothing to do with New Zealand's genuinely most hazardous, closely monitored fault systems, the Alpine Fault and the Hikurangi subduction zone, both of which remain entirely separate concerns that seismologists continue watching closely for entirely different reasons. What actually happened here is arguably more interesting than the original premise suggested. A powerful, rare earthquake on a fault so obscure that geologists still don't know exactly which specific fracture in the crust actually produced it. A genuine reminder that in a country built directly on top of an active plate boundary, meaningful seismic risk isn't always confined to the fault lines that already have a name. If stories like this, accurate, sourced directly from the scientists and agencies actually monitoring these events, are what you come here for, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because we'll keep following this story as GeoNet's analysis continues. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.